After pageantry and pleasantry, Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump got down to serious business, signing deals for hundreds of billions of U.S. dollars. What do these agreements mean for the world's two largest economies and the world as a whole? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. President Xi Jinping has called U.S. President Trump's visit to China historic. When they met the press together in the Chinese capital Thursday afternoon, President Xi highly praised Trump's visit, saying over the past 2 days they had reached a series of important consensus for bilateral ties in the future. He also insisted that although the two countries may have different views on some issues, this is natural. The Pacific Ocean, he says, is big enough to accommodate both China and the United States. And it's not just empty, and it's not empty promises, I should say. A total of over $250 billion U.S. dollars worth of bilateral trade and investment deals was signed by the two sides, setting a record in the history of world trade. The deals cover bilateral trade and investments and range from aircraft to soybean to gas pipeline from Alaska to Asia. How will the visit boost bilateral ties in the future, and what can be built on these pledges? Joining me today in our Beijing studio are Jorge Heiner, the Chilean ambassador to China, and Timothy Stratford, managing partner of the Beijing-based Covington & Burling law firm. He was also the former assistant U.S. trade representative. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. First of all, let's take a listen to what President Xi said about President Trump's visit so far.
我们回顾了海湖庄园会晤
We reviewed the important progress made in the relationship since we met at Mar-a-Lago, and we discussed how to further move forward the relationship in the months ahead in great depth. And we reached a series of new and important consensus. Our meeting is constructive and productive.
And we are also joined on the line from Geneva by Lu Xiankun, Associate Professor at the University of International Business and Economics of China. Welcome to the show, Professor Lu. Now, first, let me come to you, Tim. You were in the thick and still very much in the thick of bilateral trade and business ties between these two countries. When you hear the number $253 billion U.S. dollars, what was your first reaction?
I was surprised that the number was that large. I took it as a very good thing. It shows that the two governments are working very hard to try to demonstrate that the bilateral relationship is really beneficial to the people of both countries. It takes a lot of work to put that together. So I was impressed. At the same time, I've heard some criticism in the business community saying that this is a way of buying off the U.S. government, and that perhaps some of the deeper systemic issues in the bilateral economic relationship will not be addressed. I actually don't think that that's the problem, because I think, from my discussions with American officials, I think they're very intent on raising those issues, and I expect that we're going to actually see some very tough negotiations between the two governments in the coming months. But I think this trade deal and the very positive discussions between the two presidents has set a very positive tone that will help facilitate those tough discussions.
Yeah. Ambassador Heiner, how do you look at the significance of this stronger business ties between China and the United States for countries in the Asia-Pacific?
Well, I think it's all to the good. I mean, you look at the numbers. The U.S. is an $18 trillion economy. China is a $12 trillion economy. These are the two biggest economies in the world. And all that these deals do is give further impetus to their growth, and in doing so, they obviously help the rest of the world economy. You know, it's been said many times that China's growth over the past 2 years has contributed 30% to the economy of the world growth. So I think this is a very positive thing. Obviously, we will be parsing these deals in great detail in the course of the next few days and weeks, and we'll see whether they really amount to $253 billion. But all in all, it seems to me it's a very positive development. This part of the world is the fastest growing and most dynamic one, and all that means enhancing ties with the Americas across the Pacific is a positive thing.
And Professor Lu, let me come to you from an economist point of view, and you were also a Chinese diplomat representing China at the World Trade Organization in Geneva. How do you look at this astronomical number? For the two countries to have more sustainable trade relationship, what also has to come in the next months and if not years ahead?
Yeah, thanks. I think, of course, I agree with the other two panelists that this figure is really positive and good because it makes adds some substance to the senior visit of President Trump towards China. But also it will benefit, of course, those who have signed the contracts, but also those who have not signed but who will indirectly benefit from those contracts in both countries. But more importantly, I think, as you said, many things need to come to make this bilateral relation more sustainable. Because signing contracts are good, but those are more commercial and short-term ones. For China and the U.S. relations to be sustainable, there are some bigger systemic and structural kind of movements should be made by both sides. I think that one thing, of course, China has always been complaining about the U.S. that blocking Chinese investment and blocking U.S. exports of high-tech products, and the U.S. of course have always complaining about China's kind of less open on services and others. Those can only be resolved by structural kind of reforms on both sides, such as the BIT, the Bilateral Investment Treaty, which has been stalled for some time, but most importantly, that both countries are leading members of the WTO. How to put the bilateral relations within the multilateral framework to make sure that they could also push forward the multilateral system, and then, of course, which will benefit the bilateral relations. I think these are the things that need to come, if not in the next few months, but in a few years. Thanks.
Well, Tim, you also mentioned a similar idea that although right now there is a lot to be taken back to with President Trump to the United States, but the work ahead will be difficult. Elaborate on that, please.
There's a perception in the United States, and certainly amongst senior U.S. government officials, and also in the business community, that China altered its course somewhat after the financial crisis, the global crisis in '09, and that China became less positive about the market approach that the U.S. was advocating, and started to put more emphasis on the state's role in the economy, the role of state-owned enterprises, the role of industrial policies. And since that time, American companies have felt that the Chinese government has supported certain industries in ways that have been disruptive to normal competition, not only in the China market but in other markets. And to the extent that China has found that model to be successful, then it creates a real difficult standoff between the two countries of how to deal with that.
What is the possible way to get out of that? Through negotiations between the two sides, or signing bilateral investment treaties? What is your take?
Well, the word that you hear a lot in Washington now is the word reciprocity. And the basic idea is that if foreign companies are not allowed to do something in China, then why should Chinese companies be allowed to do that in the U.S. market? And I think that might be one of the guiding principles. We heard President Trump mention the word reciprocity during his visit. Right now, there are Chinese companies who are allowed to invest or engage in different types of business in the U.S. that are blocked for foreign companies here. And so that's one possible principle that people might be using as they talk about adjustments that each side needs to make.
Ambassador Heine, your take? You also observe China's business development, and there are also Chilean business operating in Beijing. What has been their concerns? Have they been saying the same thing?
Yes, well, our take is somewhat different. We signed, as you know, a free trade agreement with China in 2005. A lot of people were skeptical in Chile, and they said we're going to be flooded with Chinese goods and trinkets, and we are not going to be able to make any headway. That's not been the case at all. You know, our trade has quadrupled since then, fourfold. It's increased fourfold since then. We did $31 billion worth of trade last year, and you know, most of our goods come in, 97% come in here paying zero tariff. Last year we were the biggest exporter of fruit to China, bar none. China became our biggest wine market. So what I'm saying is our companies, our business have not encountered any issues, any difficulties in China, and we're doing very well. And as I said earlier, we're now moving upwards, as it were, and have negotiated an upgrade of that FTA to incorporate services, which is sort of the new frontier. By now, half of China's GDP is made up of services. So goods is not necessarily the one thing that should concern us. And so we hope that will open new possibilities and new opportunities for Chilean companies.
Yeah. Ambassador Liu in Geneva, what is your take on this question, especially your reaction to what Timothy was saying about the changing of business environment in China, making it more difficult for U.S. businesses to compete on a level playing ground?
Well, I think that the Chilean ambassador has already pointed out the right way, the right path towards the resolution of those how to say, different views, because I mean, reciprocity or not, it can only be done through a kind of a systemic structure, be it bilateral like a BIT, or be it multilateral through the WTO negotiations. And of course, investment facilitation is right now high on the WTO agenda to be discussed right now, and to see also whether at the incoming MC11 Ministerial Conference 11th one in Buenos Aires next month, and then that could be put on the table of the WTO to move things forward. And for that to happen, both China and the US as two biggest members of the WTO should play a leadership role. I think those kind of things need to be the right way to discuss all this, and then to make sure that there's a structure that will make these things sustainable instead of just bilateral initiatives.
But President Trump has been talking about withdrawing or stepping back from this multilateralism. Mr. Tim, do you see President Trump putting enough resources on this multilateral negotiations in the days ahead?
Well, I'm personally disappointed that the U.S. has pulled out of TPP, and I think to understand what was the political motivation for that, I think there's been a sense in the United States that the U.S. has fallen behind in terms of the benefits of trade, and that therefore people need to step back and re-examine things before they move ahead in the same way that they did in the past. It's very interesting to compare the Chilean situation with the U.S. situation. Chile has been a leader, a champion of free trade. They were one of the P4 that were the original nucleus of TPP, and I think they continue to set a very good example of the benefits from free trade. But if you look at the Chilean economy and the U.S. economy and compare those with the Chinese economy, right now the U.S. and the Chinese economies are both trying to compete in the same industries more directly, whereas the Chilean industry that focuses on minerals, natural resources, agriculture and services are not directly competitive in the same way. And so the challenges that our two countries deal with in discussing trade with China are somewhat different.
Indeed, very heavy challenges ahead. We're going to take a very short break, and we'll be back right after that. Stay with us. Yeah, another very interesting topic or soundbite that we heard today is from President Trump. Of course, he continued his usual line about trade needing to be fair and reciprocal. However, he said he was not going to blame China. I thought that was quite interesting. Let's take a listen to that.
Both the United States and China will have a more prosperous future if we can achieve a level economic playing field. Right now, unfortunately, it is a very one-sided and unfair one. But I don't blame China. After all, who can blame a country for being able to take advantage of another country for the benefit of its citizens? I give China great credit.
Your take about what he said, do you think he would? I think he made good sense. I really think. What is your take here?
Well, he said that the previous trade negotiators of the U.S. Were very, very stupid people, and I used to be in charge of that.
Okay, I thought what he made sense was about the part that he doesn't blame China, but the part that he blamed the previous administration, I'm with you.
No, I think that what he's saying is setting a positive setting for the negotiations that need to come. He's saying, we understand why you do what you're doing, you need to understand why we're doing, and now we're going to have some tough talks. So I think he's trying to be very, very courteous and even a little bit tongue-in-cheek in saying, you know, you've been very good, but now, you know, we're going to come to the table prepared and we're going to have some serious discussions. And that's exactly what I expect to take place over the next few months.
However, this trade imbalance, I mean, everybody is talking about this huge trade deficit. First of all, whether that is the core issue standing in between the two countries. Secondly, did the previous administration did the right thing or the wrong thing to coming to where they are today?
So if I were to critique the previous administrations, I mentioned before that I think that Chinese policymakers took a kind of adjustment in their policy after the financial crisis. I think the U.S. was sort of slow to recognize this and continued to try to pursue previous methods, and I think that over the past 7 years we've been a little bit slow to recognize adjustments that need to be made. But I think that now there's quite a consensus in the U.S. that there needs to be adjustment, and I'm quite convinced that even if Hillary Clinton had won the election, the U.S. would be making the same points to China now.
Let me make a more general point, it seems to me. Obviously, there are issues, and Tim has pointed out to some of them. At the same time, you know, this notion that, by definition, having a trade deficit with another country is a very bad thing. It doesn't hold water. I mean, what would you like? All 200 countries in the world having trade surpluses? I mean, by definition, this is unsustainable. I mean, what we want is more trade. You know, in some countries will have deficits, some will have surpluses. This will vary over time. But the notion that trade deficits, by definition, are a bad thing, it must be removed, doesn't really hold. You know, you cannot say that, you know. And that, it seems to me, is the other thing, of course, that happens in the case, in particular, of the U.S.-China relationship, is an important part of that deficit is generated by U.S. companies that produce in China and export to the United States. Now, what do you want to do? Stop that? So there are many sides to this. There are real issues. But at the same time, it's important to look back and see them in the wider context.
Professor Liu, what is your take on this issue? First of all, can we have a global trade balance between all countries? Should we really be just focusing on the trade imbalance issue? And secondly, are we seeing the right method coming on the table to resolve this issue of trade imbalance between the two countries?
I mean that trade is always something very dynamic and forward-looking. It's not something static, and you simply look at the figures and you try to find the solutions, and that's not the way out of it. If you look deeper into the U.S. trading balance with China, you will see that this is only part of a more broader or more comprehensive picture. I mean, people always say that the U.S. has a trade deficit with China about something like $260 billion US dollars. But those, as a Chilean ambassador has said, that it's only kind of traditional kind of statistics, traditional methodology. If you use the value-added methodology, you could easily bring that down by 40%. So that will be something like $160 billion US dollars. But again, this is only trading goods. If you look at traded services, the U.S. is actually the biggest source of trade deficit of China in terms of services, and which amounts to something like $60 billion US dollars. So that brings down the figure again down. And then if you look at the investment, and then you will see that the U.S. FDI stock in China is twice as big as the China's FDI stock in the U.S. And then if you add the Chinese 3 million tourists traveling and shopping in the U.S., I think you could easily see kind of more balanced picture between the two sides in terms of trade cooperation. So I think that if you go deeper into that, you will see that the figure is not that big. But more importantly, you need to look at this in a dynamic and also forward-looking way. I think both presidents have said that they are going to look at this with long-term vision. I think that's through dialogue, engagement, and in trying to resolve this. I think that's the way out of it.
Indeed. And I think the discussion today between the two presidents are also not just about trade. I mean, they really talked about this mechanism, how these two countries can build on their commonalities and manage their differences. One thing very interesting is the kind of relationship that China and the United States can have, and that's also pretty much in line with the topic, with a very hot topic in recent days in the news, is to discuss who is the most powerful man in the world. The latest edition of the Time magazine even said President Trump is meeting the world's most powerful man in Beijing. So, but this, of course, President Xi didn't address that, but this afternoon he said something that is also very interesting. Let's take a listen to this.
China and the U.S. are countries with important influence in the Asia-Pacific. As I said to President Trump, the Pacific Ocean is big enough to accommodate both of us.
So, Ambassador Heiner, have you been asked this question, you know, to compare the two countries or to compare the two leaders? Is it really the goal of China to replace the United States as the world number one?
Well, I don't see that at all. The key word here is multipolarity. You know, there was a time in the 90s in which there was talk about a unipolar moment of the United States. And what I've heard from my Chinese interlocutors is that what they see today is a very different world from that of the 90s, in the sense that we're living in a multipolar world in which you have the United States, you have China, you have other powers. And the whole idea is that to manage you know, the international situation, the international system, in partnership, in cooperation, in coordination. So that is very much what I see. And it seems to me that the visit of President Trump and the way he has been treated, this State Visit Plus, which is a new term that I had not heard before, reflects that. And the attempt to bring the two countries together and for them to work together, rather than a competition between them that, you know, may be underlying, but that doesn't need to be exacerbated or exaggerated.
Tim, how do you see the reasons behind the emergence of such a discussion at this particular moment, and also for the business world? Do you see it this way? Do you see a competition this way?
Well, there certainly is competition between the countries in a lot of different fields, and I think that's perfectly fine, and it's part of what, you know, drives human progress. If you're saying who is the most powerful man in the world, I think that's kind of a silly question. I think that President Xi is very powerful in terms of helping to set a vision for China and seeing his vision implemented, although I'm sure that he's finding and will continue to find that it's not so easy. And in the U.S. we've watched, you know, the Trump administration trying to deal with legislative agendas and other things, and I think he's finding it very difficult to do that. So if you say that one leader can snap his fingers and what he wants materializes, perhaps President Xi is able to do that a little bit more in China than President Trump is in the U.S. right now. But to say that one man is more powerful than the other in absolute terms, I think that's kind of a silly line of thought.
A mass media question, maybe, to grab people's attention. Anyway, Professor Liu, we are still in the thick of the mass media, so we are talking about this. What's your take on this question?
Oh, well, I think I totally agree with Tim that this is a multi kind of, and also Chilean ambassador, that this is a multipolar world now, that no one is more powerful than any other leaders. You need a collective endeavor to make things happen. Of course, we economists always say that there's an obvious shifting of power kind of towards more balanced structure in the world governance. And of course, not only China, but other emerging economies like India and Brazil are also kind of taking more responsibility, while the US and the EU should be ready to share that kind of responsibility towards these emerging economies. But I mean, in one word, you need a collective endeavor by both traditional players, but also emerging economies to work together to resolve the global problems.
My last question, we are heading into this very important meeting, APEC, that's going to take place in Vietnam. President Xi, President Trump will be there, and also Chilean President
Bachelet.
Yeah, will also be there. For the countries in the region and other countries in the world, what kind of message do you think countries will be watching out for coming from the US President?
Yes. Well, this is a very important meeting. It's the first time Vietnam is hosting an APEC summit. It's the first time President Trump will attend an APEC summit. So the eyes of the world will be in Da Nang the next 2 days. I think it's important that the message that comes out is that we need to continue to press for freer and more liberalized trade across the Pacific. You know, this is the most dynamic area of the world. These are the fastest growing economies.
However, you are unlikely
if we don't
to hear
push
that
for this,
from President Trump.
No, I know. But the point I'm trying to make is that there may be, you know, a consensus among the rest of the leaders. Maybe they can move Mr. Trump around to being less insistent on some of his earlier points. The point is that unless we agree on the fact that we need to push for freer trade across the Pacific, there will be a problem. So that, it seems to me, is the underlying issue. Now, the question is, how do you do that? So there are various proposals on the table. One is the TPP -1, all the signatories minus the US. Then there is something called, what some have referred to as the TPP-8, the 4 countries of the Pacific Alliance in Latin America, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, plus Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Singapore that are now negotiated together. And then, of course, there's the RCEP, which China has been championing. Yeah. And then there's the FTAAP, the Free Trade Area of the Pacific. So it's a real smorgasbord of alternatives. Yeah. And it's important to move forward on at least some of them.
Yeah, let's keep a close watch on the situation. Many thanks to our guests, Jorge Heine, the Chilean ambassador to China, Tim Stratford, managing partner of the Beijing-based Covington & Berlin, and Lu Xiankun, associate professor at the University of International Business and Economics of China. And my last point, $253 billion, that shows the kind of potential when the world's biggest economies join hands to tackle a challenge. The good chemistry between the two leaders will also help steer future relations through thick and thin, rain or shine. President Trump seems to be unbothered by the notion that he handed leadership of the world to China. He knows too well that America needs to take care of itself. On China's part, on the one hand, it's too early for China to talk about leading the world. We still have a long way to go in building ourselves. On the other hand, the world cannot and should not be led by one single country. Hegemony and the complacency that comes with it will result in eventual decline, a pitfall that China should work to avoid. We're not in a race against others, but with ourselves. That's it for this edition of The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got the point.